Certainly want to welcome everyone back. I hope everyone had a very good and profitable Thanksgiving holiday period. Know that it was enjoyable for me, and so hope it was for you as well. It always is a good thing to stop and give thanks to a loving Heavenly Father for all that we have received in our life. And we need to continue to be a thankful people, and that thankfulness should lead, of course, to a thankworthy type of life. We have, of course, this class, and then next week, and then our class will be over. Most of you have sent an email to me stating that you have done the reading that was required, both Joshua and Judges, reading that 2 times, and then reading a commentary on Joshua and a commentary on Judges. If you need to do that. If you haven't, and if you haven't done it, you need to finish that up. And then, of course, the second term paper is due today, so you need to be finishing that up. And sending that or emailing that to me as well. Of course, should not be late on that, but that is due today. That second term paper. When we ended our study last time, we were closing out of Gideon's death in Judges, the 8th chapter, and we had just begun and didn't really have time to go into it, but in the 8th chapter, verses 33 through 35, we have Israel's apostasy. Israel's apostasy. And in these 3 verses, we have 3 things that are mentioned in relationship to Israel's apostasy. And I think we talked last week about the first of these, at least a little bit, or initially. The first is that they refuse to be righteous. We see that after Gideon's death, that the children of Israel turned again and went a-whoring after Balaam and made Baal-berith their god. So they went into idolatry once again, like so many other times. And what we see throughout this period of time, that when the judge dies, they depart from God and go after idolatry. Baal-berith means Baal, or of the covenant. Berith, dealing with covenant, and thus covenant with Baal. Verse 34 now, and I think we dealt with that a little bit last week, so we won't go into detail on that. But the second point found in verse 34 is that Israel did not remember God. And what we see with this, in not remembering Jehovah their God, who had delivered, and he mentions who had delivered them out of the hands of all their enemies on every side. It shows, in reality, a lack of respect and a lack of gratitude for God on Israel's part. It's almost amazing that during the times of oppression, when they were hurting so much, they had so much opposition to them and all of this, that they would, in a last-ditch effort, cry out to God who would save them. However, when God then delivered them, and that deliverer, that judge, died, they would go right back to their wickedness and forget what God had done for them. They did not remember God. As long as we remember God and what God has done for us, then we're not going to apostatize. Apostasy comes when we start forgetting God. In 2 Peter, Peter discusses the aspect of our need to put the brethren in remembrance of these things. So often that is the case. In going through chapter 1 of 2 Peter, you see that here's these Christian graces that we are to add to our life. And he tells us in verse 9 that he that lacketh these things there are those Christian graces, those attitudes, those attributes that we are to add to our life. He that lacketh these things is blind and cannot see afar off. But now then notice this, he hath forgotten that he was purged from his old sins. In other words, if a person remembers what God has done for them, then they will never fall. And that's the statement in verse 10. The person who lacks these things, blind, cannot see afar off, forgotten that he was purged from his old sins. Wherefore the rather, brethren, give diligence to make your calling and election sure. For if you do these things, ye shall never fall. If you fail to do these things, you will fall. But if you add these things, and why are we going to add these things to our lives? Because we remember what God has done for us, and how that he has purged us from our sins, cleansed us, and made us free from those things. When we keep that in the forefront of our minds, then we won't fall. We'll be adding these Christian graces to our life. And so it becomes important for those who are preaching God's Word and for brethren to keep these things in our minds. That's verse 13 through 15 there. When he says, is in 2 Peter 1, yea, I think it meet, as long as I am in this tabernacle, to stir you up by putting you in remembrance, knowing that shortly I must put off this my tabernacle, even as our Lord Jesus Christ it showed me. Moreover, I will endeavor that ye may be able by my decrees to have these things always in remembrance. He wants us to remember these things because he knows the importance of it. And in chapter 3 and verse 1 of 2 Peter, this second epistle, beloved, I now write unto you, in both which I stir up your pure minds by way of remembrance. He says that that's what my purpose is to stir up your minds, put you in remembrance of these things, even though you might know them, because he knew the importance of remembering. If we can get brethren to continue to remember what God has done for us, then we won't apostatize. And in that Thanksgiving break that we just took, when we are thankful for God, part of that is we are remembering what God has done for us. Well, when we remember that, there's a thankfulness for what God has done in saving us from sin, and it will cause us not to fall away, but to live in such a way as to please him. So we see that aspect of this, and then closely akin with this that we're talking about, the third point in verse 35 is that they showed ingratitude. They did not show kindness to the house of Jerubbaal or Gideon. according to all the goodness which he had showed unto Israel. So it shows here's Gideon and all his goodness toward Israel and his actions, but they didn't show gratitude for that. They were ungrateful. And because of that ingratitude, it caused them to go into sin. And again, I say that's closely akin with that remembering what God has done for us. When we remember what God has done, we become thankful. There is that expression of gratitude, both in our speech and in our actions. When we forget God, then we become ungrateful. And that is truly, when we get in that spiritual realm, a horrible sin that we become involved in. So here's these three aspects, or three things mentioned in these three verses, and they make a good sermon outline, really. Refusing to be righteous, not remembering God, and ungrateful. Chapter 9 now. We go into Abimelech and the Shechemites. Abimelech and the Shechemites. In the first 6 verses, we see there Abimelech becoming king. Abimelech becoming king in the first 6 verses of chapter 9. And kind of an introduction to this, there's a question as to whether or not Abimelech should be included in the list of judges. There's good reasons not to include him. It does not appear as if Abimelech really was a deliverer of Israel. It does not state, as it does with so many of the judges, that God raised him up to be a judge over Israel, or God raising him up to deliver them. As a result, a lot of people, and if you do it reading and other books and such, a lot of people will not list Abimelech as a judge, and thus the total number of judges that they would give would be 14 instead of the 15 that we have. We have gone ahead and listed him as one of the judges, even though there's good arguments for him not to be. He does play a prominent role in Israel's history, and from that standpoint, we include him in the list of judges, a prominent role during this period of time, and what the Bible states here in regards to him. That's why we go ahead and list him, even though he might not technically be a judge. We go ahead and list him in that listing of the judges. But really, that's more of a man-made decision as to whether or not to include him or not. Doesn't matter, thus, whether we include him or do not include him. If you don't want to on a list when you're teaching a class, then don't. But generally our brethren have through the years listed him as one of the judges. Abimelech, we're going to see, has a desire for power. Certainly there are some desires that are right and needful. In Colossians 3 and verses 1 and 2 in particular, it shows to desire spiritual things, things which are above. Those are the things which we are to desire. There's others, of course, desires that are wrong. Generally, the word desire and the word lust from the Greek standpoint comes from the same word. It deals with a zeal that is within one. Thus, that zeal that an individual has can be for things which are right, translated generally desire, or it can be things which are wrong, generally translated lust. I don't know of any case where lust is used, or the word is translated lust in a good sense. Generally, it's always in a negative sense. But desire is still there. There's a desire on man's part. Well, Abimelech had a desire for power. I want to mention one aspect, and that is in elders. With elders, and one of the qualifications as listed in 1 Timothy 3 and verse 1 is that they desire the office of an elder. And it says that he desires a good work then. So a desire for the work is important. It is a qualification for eldership. But in that desire, we also see in 3 John in verses 9 and 10 that there can be an improper desire in relationship to even becoming an elder. When someone has a desire for preeminence, then that individual simply should not be made an elder. That can cause no doubt of problems within the Lord's church. Let me stop that ring. When we have someone and place someone within the eldership that is having a desire for power, a lust for power, then they're going to have problems within the Lord's church on that. The congregation is going to have a lot of problems with that individual. We see that with Diotrephes there in 3 John 9 and 10. He had that desire for preeminence, and because of that desire, he had a aspect of putting people out of the church, not extending fellowship properly. He wanted the power. That desire for being an elder also cannot simply be a desire for making decisions. I can make decisions better than anybody else, so let me do it. Instead, the desire has to be in relationship to the work that is necessary. That here I have a work that I am involved in, and that God wants me to, that needs to be filled, and that I need to have. And so we have that type of a desire for that work and to fulfill that work. Then that type of a desire is the type of desire which is needed for someone being an elder. If they do not desire the work, and that's the aspect there, if a man desires the work of an elder, and I wish kind of that they had translated it the work of an elder instead of the office, then it is a desire that is right, because he wants to do the work that God has set forth for that individual. Well, here Abimelech, though, had a desire for power. So he goes to Shechem, and he asks them to allow him to rule over them. There you start seeing again the desire for power in that regard. Constable says that Shechem was one of the older city-states in Canaan, And Canaanites were its main inhabitants, as is evident from this story. So here's the Canaanites that he goes to and says, let me rule over you. And he presents himself in this way. Here's all of these sons of Gideon. There's 70 sons that Gideon had. What would be better? Would it be better for you to have all 70 of these people ruling over you? Or would it be better for just one individual to rule over you? And notice there in verse 3, he talks about reigning over you. He wanted that power, and that shows he wants to be king. He wants power. Wants to be over these people. Additionally, he appeals to them, remember, I'm your bone and your flesh, and so he appeals to family relations, as opposed to, it's not stated, but it's indicated, these other 70 sons of Gideon, they're not your family, I am. So you ought to, it'd be better to have me as king over you than to have one of them or all of them ruling over you. In verse 3, then, he goes on that the men are beginning to agree with him that, yes, it would be better for you to reign over us than for all of the others. And they agree, yes, you are our family, you're our brother. So, verse 4, the men of Shechem give him 70 pieces of silver from the house of Baal-berith. And with these 70 pieces of silver, Abimelech goes out and he hires worthless people to follow him. Now this, to a great extent, shows the type of character which Abimelech really is. In going into office, one of the presidents, if you look at what they want and what they're going to do within their administration, how they're going to control things and run things, you start looking at who he surrounds himself with and who he hires to fill the different posts and the different offices which they have. And you can tell a lot about a man's character by the type of people that he takes as his associates. Well, you can tell a lot about Abimelech when he goes out and he hires for himself worthless men. And vain, and as put here, vain and light persons to follow him. You see the character of Abimelech in that. And it should have caused the men to flee from him and say, forget you, but they didn't. Verse 5, thus, with these individuals that he has now hired, he goes in and kills all of his brothers, with, of course, one exception, and that's Jotham. Jotham had hid, and thus he escaped this death that Abimelech brings. And it states that it was upon one stone. The idea of one stone denotes that it was an execution, that this wasn't something that was done in battle, that these sons of Gideon were killed in battle, but instead these that Abimelech hired came in, they took the 70 sons or captured them, and then they executed them. The idea again of one stone would probably indicate a chopping block where their heads were probably cut off. And so their heads were put on the chopping block and they were cut off, and thus Abimelech does away with all of these brothers. Verse 6, then, the men of Shechem gathered together, and they make Abimelech king. And that, again, the idea that he using the word to reign over you. He wanted to reign. Well, now then they're making him king. I think it's interesting. In the previous chapter, we saw that men of Israel come to Gideon, and they ask him, rule over us. And Gideon refuses, saying that there's one individual who rules over us, and that's God. Now then, Abimelech goes and says, I want to rule over you. Quite a difference in the attitudes expressed between the two individuals. Kyle and Delitzsch write concerning this that the inhabitants of Shechem, the worshippers of Baal-berith, carried out the election of Abimelech as king in the very same place in which Joshua had held the last national assembly and had renewed the covenant of Israel with Jehovah, the true covenant God. Joshua 24, 1, 25, and 26. It was there, in all probability, that the temple of Baal-berith was to be found, namely, according to verse 46, near the tower of Shechem, or the citadel of Milo. So here it is, in this same place where they had renewed, or Joshua had renewed the covenant with God. Here now, these men of Shechem are electing or appointing Abimelech as king instead of having God as king. Now in verses 7 through verse 21, we have Jotham's fable. Jotham's fable. Jotham, the name, means Jehovah is perfect or honest. And Jotham goes to the top of Mount Gerizim and relates this fable to them. Winton notes that his location would make it possible for him to speak to the culprits in this rebellious enterprise and at the same time enjoy a measure of safety. He would be able to see anyone who tried to come up after him in time to escape. So here he is in safety. If anyone tried to come and capture him, he could have run away and escaped. And yet it also provided him a place in which he could speak, and it was, again, a natural amphitheater which would allow him to be heard among all of the people. So now then, he begins with this fable. And he sets forth, here's these trees. And they agree among themselves to appoint a king over them. So they ask first the olive tree, will you be our king? In verse 9, the olive tree rejects the offer to rule over the trees with the statement, basically, I have more important things to do than to rule over you. Well, that being rebuffed, verse 10, they now ask the fig tree, will you reign over us? Will you be our king over us? Well, verse 11, the fig tree rejected the tree's offer also, even as the olive tree had rejected the offer, and with the same reason. I have more important things. I have a more important mission than to reign over you, so no, I will not be your king. Verse 12, they then turn to the vine and ask the vine, will you be our king? And the vine here would be the grapevine. Verse 13, the vine also rejects the offer of the trees with the same reasoning. I have more important things to do than to reign over you. It's important to remember that in Canaan, as Jotham goes through this parable, in Canaan, the most important products were oil, figs, and wine. Oil coming from the olive tree, figs coming from the fig tree, and wine coming from the vine. So here in this fable, Jotham uses the three most important, or the products, or what originates the three most important products of Canaan. The trees going to those things that are most important in Canaan and asking them to reign over them. And those that were important said no. So notice the contrast. Here's the important things. Now then we're going to go over here to something that is worthless. Verse 14. The trees that now ask the bramble to rule over us. Bramble is a thistle or a briar, and it's really something that's pretty much worthless, has no value. The only thing, if you can call it a value, and I'm using that very loosely in this, the only value that it would have would be that it would harm those who came near it. The stickers and harming them, and as far as good, it had no value whatsoever. Well, verse 15, and again, you have to understand, here's the one now that the trees have come to and said, be our king. Verse 15, the bramble quickly agrees to be their king and demands that the trees put their complete trust in the bramble's shadow. Now understand this, and you can see the ridicule of this situation. That here's a great tree that has a great amount of shade in it, and they go to this bramble that wouldn't have any shade really whatsoever, that's totally worthless. And the bramble is saying, yes, I'll be your king, but for me to be your king, you have to put your trust in my shadow. He didn't have a shadow. Here's the trees that do, and yet the bramble saying, you put your complete trust in my shadow. A completely foolish type of a situation. Well, that's the fable that Jotham has set forth. Now then, verse 16, he starts making the application of the fable. And of course, in the fable, the bramble has reference to Abimelech. And Shechem would have reference to the trees, and the trees going to Shechem, going to Abimelech, the bramble, and making the bramble king over them, or making Abimelech king over the men of Shechem. And he asked them, if you think that this is a proper treatment of the house of Gideon, or house of Jerubbaal, if you think this is treating them correctly, if this is right, especially you look at what you have allowed Abimelech to do in executing all of these sons of Gideon, then you go ahead and glory in Abimelech. In verse 17, he reminds the men of Shechem the good that Gideon had done to them, and how he had risked his life for them in fighting the Midianites. You went to him and you asked him to fight the Midianites for you, and he put his life on the line for you. And now then you allow Abimelech, and you treat Abimelech in this, or you allow Abimelech and you treat the house of Gideon in this way. You think that's right? If you do, then yes, you glory in Abimelech. Verse 18, they had risen up and slain Gideon's sons. And notice that he puts the killing of Gideon's sons on the men of Shechem. And how did they do it? Well, they gave Abimelech the money to hire these men to go and put them to death. Thus, the men of Shechem were guilty of murder. And then likewise they had made Abimelech their king. When he was the son of a maidservant, or a concubine, chapter 8 and verse 31. Verse 19, Jotham scorns them, uses words of scorn. If this is the way that Gideon and his house should be treated, then you go ahead and rejoice in Abimelech. That's words of scorn. They should realize that's no way to treat Gideon and his house. You did them wrong. But if you think it's right, if you think this is the way that he should have been treated, then you're getting exactly what you deserve. Verse 20, Jotham now pronounces a curse upon them. If this is not the way that Gideon and his house should be treated, then let fire come out and destroy both you and Abimelech. Well, of course, as one looks at this and you just see the situation with, here's Gideon and he puts his life on the line in fighting for the men of Shechem, and then men of Shechem pay Abimelech or give him money to allow him to go out and hire people to go and kill all of Gideon's sons. Well, that's obviously not right. It's evil on the very surface of it. And so he is saying, because you have done this, it's not the way that they should have been treated, thus let this happen to you. Let fire come out and devour both you and Abimelech. This curse actually was fulfilled about 3 years later. Constable notes also concerning this verse that bramble would spontaneously burst into flames in hot weather and sometimes caused much damage consequently. So here he's saying, let fire come out and devour you and Abimelech. When he's used this illustration, Abimelech is like bramble. And bramble would spontaneously burst into flames in hot weather. And in verse 21 then, after saying and making these statements, Jotham flees to Beer. The word Beer means well. And of course he's fleeing to Beer to hide from Abimelech's anger. Of course, Abimelech has already killed all of Jotham's brothers, and he intended to kill Jotham also, and it was only because Jotham hid that he escaped. Now then, he pronounces this fable and curses Abimelech and men of Shechem. Well, Abimelech's going to be rather upset, and he's going to try and kill him again. So here Jotham flees to escape that anger. Where Beer is, we don't know. So the site very simply is unknown. He escapes wherever this is, but he escapes out of Abimelech's hand. Now then, in verses 22 through verse 49, we have a quarrel between Abimelech and the Shechemites. Verse 22, we see God responding after these 3 years of Abimelech's reign. God sends, verse 23, an evil spirit to divide the men of Shechem and Abimelech. This evil spirit, when we think of an evil spirit, especially as we read and study the New Testament, we generally think of it in regards to demon possession. That here is someone who is possessed of demons, and it affords Christ and the apostles and those whom Christ had sent out to cast that demon out of that individual, and it thus shows the power of God is greater than the power of Satan or the power of demons. Well, here that does not seem to be the case as we look at this idea of an evil spirit that is presented to us here in verse 23. Instead, the evil spirit seems to be dealing with a disposition of heart or mind that was evil, a discontent with each other. And so, while for these 3 years Abimelech and the men of Shechem, they are in harmony or they don't have too much difficulties, when you appoint someone as a leader like unto Abimelech who had that desire for preeminence or power, trouble's going to come. And so here's this growing discontent between between Abimelech and the men of Shechem. It's also interesting here as we see this that it is between Abimelech and the men of Shechem. Apparently, Abimelech was never accepted as king over all of Israel. He was a localized king over the men of Shechem. He was accepted by them, but not by Israel as a whole, and so we're dealing with a local situation here. Verse 24, they put Abimelech to death. And this was done in divine retribution of the murder of Gideon's sons. Again, while the men of Shechem might not have done this themselves, they did not do the actual killing, they were still guilty before God because they aided or assisted Abimelech in the action of killing Gideon's sons. And we mentioned that earlier, but I think a good comparison along that line would be in Acts, the 2nd chapter. Peter accuses the Jews, "You have by wicked hands taken and crucified the Son of God." Well, had they actually done the crucifying? No. They turned him over to the Romans. And the Romans are the ones who actually put Jesus to death. But yet Peter is saying, you Jews are the ones who have done it. Why? They are the ones who brought it about. Same principle is being seen here. For the men of Shechem dealing treacherously with Abimelech, that the cruelty done to the 70 sons of Jerubbaal might come, and their blood be laid upon Abimelech and their brother, which slew them, and the men of Shechem, which aided him in killing of his brethren. So they aided him, and thus they were just as guilty as Abimelech in it, just as the Jews were just as guilty, if not even more so, of the Romans in crucifying Jesus. Verse 25, the men of Shechem set liars in wait. This is, they're setting an ambush to have an ambush out here to find and to kill Abimelech. But in this, setting these men out here as liars in wait, while they were waiting to find Abimelech, anyone who would come along, they would rob. Shows, again, the type of people that the men of Shechem were associated with, and the type of, thus, moral degradation to which this area had degraded to. They should have been holding up things and spirituality, but they didn't. But verse 25 also shows that Abimelech was told about it. He was informed about what was going on. Verse 26, we're introduced to Gaal and his brethren who went to Shechem and won their support. Verse 27, they went into the field and harvested the grapes and made wine, and then entered into the idol's temple. They ate, and they cursed Abimelech. So here's Gael and those men who were with him, and they are just having a good old time, and they're cursing Abimelech as well. Verse 28, we continue with this, that Gael denigrates Abimelech, but also denigrates Gideon, along with the men of Shechem. So they are just bad-mouthing all of them. Kyle and Delitzsch write about this, that Abimelech was regarded by him as contemptible, that is, regarded by Gael as contemptible, not because he was the son of a maidservant or of a very low birth, nor because he was ambitious and cruel, patricide, and the murderer of his brethren. That would be what Rosenmuller would say. But because he was a son of Jerubbaal, a son of the man who destroyed the altar of Baal at Shechem and restored the worship of Jehovah, for which the Shechemites themselves had endeavored to slay him, Judges 6:27 and following. So here's why they are ridiculing Abimelech and regarded him as contemptible. Why? He's the son of Jerubbaal. Look at what Jerubbaal did in destroying the temple of the altar of Baal and setting up this worship of Jehovah. And so they hated Abimelech because of what Gideon or Jerubbaal had done. Also in this verse, Zebul is mentioned to us as being the governor, his officer. That would be Abimelech's governor. So he is saying that there's no need to serve Abimelech or his governor. Basically, we're here now, you can serve us. You don't have to serve Abimelech and his leadership. Verse 29, now then he calls Abimelech to battle. And in verse 30, Zebul, who was Abimelech's governor, learns what Gael had said, and of course it upsets him, it makes him angry. And in verse 31, Zebul sends messengers to Abimelech informing him that Gael and his men of Shechem are rebelling. Here's Abimelech, his quest for power and preeminence, and now then that city, or those men who had made him king, they're rebelling against him. And he finds out from Zebul that now then they're fortifying the city against me. So verse 32, Zebul advises Abimelech, you come to Shechem by night and you set up an ambush in the field. Now then, verse 33, when morning comes, they can then come out against the city and get Gael and his forces can come out to meet them in battle. In verse 34, Abimelech starts following Zebul's advice. And he comes there, he divides his forces in 4 companies positioned around the city. In verse 35, Gael comes out and stands in the gate of the city, and then Abimelech shows himself to them, to Gael. And verse 36, Gael sees them and tells Zebul that he sees people coming. See some people out there. But Zebul ridicules him, saying, oh, you're only imagining things. You've been out here, it's kind of like you've been out here bad-mouthing Abimelech, and now then you've called him to war, and now then you're just seeing things. You're imagining this. Well, we'll start with verse 37 because it's time for our break at this point in time. So we'll start there in our next hour.